everyone, and welcome to our 12th weekly segment. We're going to be starting with a look at the situation in Ukraine. So we're going to start with what Putin just said, which is that the war in Ukraine has become extremely difficult. Which again, we're seeing an increasing pattern of Kremlin insecurity. And the important thing to understand here is that this does not mean that the war is going to end soon, and this does not mean that Putin is planning to slow down or stop in any particular way. He might be forced to. He might not have a choice, but that is not his intention, and that is not what he is signaling here. As has been the pattern, there's been some shelling in the Kherson region, but most of the actual fighting is very heavily concentrated in the Donbass region. There's also one really big piece of news this week, which was, I believe, announced only about an hour or two ago. The United States is going to provide Ukraine with one battery of the Patriot missile defense system, which is, I believe, currently the most advanced missile defense system in the world, and a single battery, which is what Ukraine is getting, has value of estimated a little bit over $1 billion. It will probably take a fair while for it to arrive, and for the Ukrainian troops to be trained on it, but it should make a substantial difference in the air war. Now, Putin gave a speech today for Security Agency Workers' Day, and everyone has focused very heavily on his call for increased focus on catching traitors, spies, and enemies, that sort of thing. And of course that's important, that's notable. But one thing that I've noticed hasn't been mentioned very much in the coverage of this is what he says about nationalism. Now I'm going to read directly from it. You must stay focused in such an important area as countering extremism. Belligerent nationalism calls for violence and provocation aimed at stirring up ethnic hatred, are a direct threat to our society's internal unity. Special services must respond to such attempts promptly. There's a lot of other things in there that are also very telling, but I don't think there's anything else that's particularly new. All this stuff about finding the traitors and the security service being an essential pillar of Russian civilization is something that we've heard before and that we kind of know that this is what he thinks. But this I find very interesting. Don't put too much focus on it, because it could be nothing, but it could be interesting. It's a potential pointer in a specific direction, and in a direction that we seem to see the Kremlin moving, not just with this, but with a number of other things over the past months. Now we're going to get to the meat of what I want to talk about in this episode, and that is Mikhail Khodorkovsky's op-ed in The Economist last month. Now, for those who don't know, Khodorkovsky was previously the richest person in Russia. Until 2003, he owned the major oil company Yukos, until he was imprisoned mostly for political reasons, or entirely for political reasons, although there was some legitimately questionable corruption going on. That was not the reason at all. And Yukos was forcibly sold to the Russian state oil company Rosneft. He was eventually pardoned and released in 2013, and now he lives in London, and he has continued to be a fairly aggressive critic of Putin and his government. Now, the article focuses on why the West shouldn't push Ukraine towards peace talks, and you'll probably know if you've heard this show before, I agree with him, and I think there's a lot of things worth commenting on this article that he gets right, but I also think there are a few things he gets wrong, so let's get into that. So Khodorkovsky is right that the most important thing right now for Putin is a breather or a break in the fighting so that he can regroup, rearm, and reorganize. And it is very important that he does not get this. He's also right that what Putin would perceive as a surrender in Ukraine would contribute to an increasing pattern of aggression and would contribute to escalation as well. Not nuclear escalation per se, but escalation in general. And he's also right that Putin would not be bound by any terms in any deal that he would make, and that it would not be lasting. And I think those are the most important points that he is right about in this article. So now let's look at what he got wrong, and particularly what I think is the most glaring error here. Khodorkovsky says he doubts Putin will take the path towards nuclear escalation, and that he lists some very good reasons why Putin shouldn't. But the problem is that reasons why he shouldn't aren't necessarily reasons why he wouldn't. So it's very easy to list the negative consequences of nuclear escalation. Alienating allies, creating an increasingly aggressive and hostile NATO, possibly even direct military intervention. But here's the thing. I could come up with an equally convincing list of reasons why he shouldn't have invaded Ukraine that were foreseeable. military losses, economic costs, sanctions, hostile neighbors, questioning allies, wondering if Putin's Russia is really reliable and to be trusted. But he did it anyway. He is not, at least in our conception, a rational actor. He is pursuing his goals rationally in a way that he thinks will be effective and will produce the best results, but his goals are not necessarily grounded in the same concrete reality that we tend to think in. A lot of his goals and beliefs and driving factors are philosophical, ideological, even mystical sometimes. And he's said things like this. If there's a nuclear war, we'll go straight to heaven and you won't even have time to repent. And there's another quote from him, I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me right now, but what good is the world without Russia in it? And he does very much mix up where he ends and Russia begins. So to him, Putin and Russia are in many ways interchangeable and intermingled and interconnected. So it's very possible, and I think likely, that if he felt that his civilizational mission and Russia in general were threatened in his regime, he would consider nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean he would use them, that's not what I'm saying. But I do think we have to consider seriously the possibility, and I don't think that we can dismiss it as easily as Khodorkovsky dismisses it in this article. Now, my second issue is almost not worth mentioning. It's kind of an issue of phrasing. But he says in the article that if there was a second wave of mobilization, there would be a high risk of the regime being overthrown. And again, this might seem kind of innocuous because I'm not going to correct it much. But there would be a period of elevated risk. It would be significantly higher than it is right now, but that doesn't mean it's high on its own. It would still be unlikely. It would not be a likely thing. It would not be a sure thing by any means. It would be more likely than now, but it would not be a high risk. And the final thing that I want to comment on that I think is partially correct, but again phrased maybe slightly wrong, is that Khodorkovsky says that the war cannot end without regime change. And we have to be very careful about what we mean by regime. Do we mean the entire government, the state apparatus, the Putin government, everyone, Patrushev, Bortnikov, Shoigu, Lavrov? Do all of these people have to go, or are we talking about Putin? Usually when we use the word regime, we're talking about the whole government. And the whole government doesn't need to go for peace. I think it needs to go in general, both for Russia and for the world. But for peace, it is not a necessity. Putin has to go. He is right about that. But there are some people right now who would probably prefer to choose peace if they were making the decisions, if Putin was not there. Lavrov wasn't even warned about the invasion. I think he would probably choose peace. There are others. Nabulina, who heads the central bank and already tried to resign. Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow. There are people who want out, who want the war over. So the whole regime, in general, I think has to go. But this is not a requirement for a lasting peace. This is a requirement for a stable and healthy Russia. But there are people in the current regime who could be made peace with if Putin was gone. And I don't know if this is a distinction that we would expect him to make here, because it seems to me that he's not genuinely doing analysis of Russian politics or of the war. He is doing activism, which is important, and there is a place for it. But that's not what we're doing here. So we're going to make that distinction. And that wraps up our 12th weekly segment. This is the 20th of December, 2022, and thank you for listening.